Hey everyone, Mr. Young here with your video today on Mesopotamia, the first of the four river valley civilizations that we'll be talking about. So as always, make sure you have your note sheets out ready to go to get down those key ideas, phrases, and words. So the earliest civilizations that we know of were all situated near major rivers. And you gotta ask, well, why is this the case? So if you think back to our last lecture on civilizations, we know that they were able to be established because people had a consistent food source. And that was because of farming and the domestication of animals. So rivers were ideal for farming because the areas around them were deposited with this layer of soil called silt, which was incredibly fertile and ideal for farming. Rivers also represented a regular water supply for people to drink, as well as animals to drink. So remember, domestication was a big part of the Neolithic Revolution, where people started to adapt animals for their own use. So rather than going out and hunting these animals, they could just collect them as they flocked near the rivers and then breed them for their own use. And finally, rivers were ideal as a means of transportation. So rather than walking from place to place, people could now use boats and barges to get to places at a faster rate. So the first civilization we're going to discuss is Mesopotamia. And in Greek, Mesopotamia means land between two rivers. And the two rivers that we are discussing are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So on your map, we're looking at this green portion right here. And this whole area collectively is known as the Fertile Crescent. Now, in general, this area of the world, known as the Middle East, is pretty dry or arid. So farming is not something you necessarily would associate with this. But again, because of the rich deposits of silt in between these two rivers, it was the perfect spot for civilization to emerge. So around 5,000 years ago, the first villages began to develop between these two rivers. And over time, these villages grew in size to where they became big cities and eventually became known as city-states. So a city-state is a territory consisting of a city and its surrounding areas that acted like a country. So if you want to put it in terms of New York State, for example. So if New York State was made up of a collection of city-states, we'd have Syracuse. So Syracuse would be the major city, and then the surrounding areas might be like Lafayette and Tully and Fayetteville and Liverpool and North Syracuse and Auburn. So that would collectively be a city-state. And then Rochester would be a city-state with its surrounding areas, and Buffalo and Albany and Binghamton and so on and so forth. So each of these areas would act like a country with its own rules, its own leaders. So in this area, all of these little red dots represent city-states between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And collectively, they became known as the civilization of Sumer. And we call these people the Sumerians. So the ancient Sumerians were very advanced people, and one of the ways that they demonstrated this was by the use of irrigation. So irrigation is a system where you dig ditches and canals to control water for farming. Now, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded unpredictably. So by digging these canals and ditches, the Sumerians were able to divert water away from their crops to prevent their yield from being completely destroyed. So this is an example of them adapting to their geography in order to benefit their society as a whole. Now, this idea of irrigation is going to be copied around other civilizations like Egypt and in the Indus River Valley that we'll talk about a little bit later. One of the other ways the Sumerians were advanced was with their building. And one of the most prominent features of their societies were their ziggurats. And these were giant step pyramids that were used for religious purposes. So as we talked about with civilization, many of the early places were polytheistic, meaning that they believed in many gods. And the Sumerians were no different. So a lot of times they would have a god that represented an individual force in nature. So these ziggurats were used for ceremonies where priests would go to the top of the temple and perform services or rituals or offerings in order to appease those gods. But perhaps one of the biggest accomplishments of the Sumerians was developing the world's first writing system, and this was called cuneiform, or wedge-shaped writing that was molded onto clay tablets using a stylus. So if you look down below at the bottom of the screen, you can see that this is an example of cuneiform with wedges arranged in a particular order in order to record something. So early writing was used to record usually something related to farming, and then eventually over time it was adapted to use for tax records or to write down laws so that everybody could see them and they were put in public so everybody knew what to follow and what the punishments for breaking the law would be. One other area of accomplishment for the Sumerians was in mathematics, where they developed a number system based off of 6, so 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, and some historians believe they were even the first to use wheeled vehicles. Now, they also had accomplishments in the field of astronomy, where they studied the stars and planets and the sun, which allowed them to create an accurate 365-day calendar. Now, around 2500 BC, the Sumerian city-states began to fall as armies from the outside came in and began to conquer them. So within a 600-year period, the Sumerian civilizations were replaced by these empires. So let's talk a little bit about what an empire is. So if you've ever seen the Star Wars movies, this is a perfect example of what an empire is and what it's all about. So an empire is a collection of territories or states under the control of one ruler. So in the Star Wars movies, the collection of states would be all the planets in the galaxy, and the one source of ruling would be the evil emperor. Okay, so that makes up the empire in the Star Wars saga. So some of the empires that came in to Mesopotamia destroyed, while others decided to preserve and to keep some of Sumerian society and to build well-organized empires. So one of these empires was the Babylonian Empire that was established by King Hammurabi around 1790 BC. So what Hammurabi is most well known for is his code of laws known as Hammurabi's Code. And these were 282 laws on all aspects of life. And as you can see on the left hand side here, they were written down on a stone pillar for everybody to see, so you knew what the laws were and you knew what the punishments were as well. So this way you couldn't plead ignorance and say, well, I didn't know what the law was, so you can't punish me for breaking it. Not the case. Alright. Now what was most famous from this is the idea of corporal punishment, or an eye for an eye. So these punishments were very severe. So say for example that you stole something. What they might do as a punishment is cut off your hand from which you stole something. So this is the first set of codified laws that people all around the world began to replicate after this. So delving into Hammurabi's Code a little bit more, it was unique in that it addressed both civil and criminal law. So you may be familiar with criminal law, but not so much civil law. So this dealt with offenses in private rights and matters, like contracts and taxes and marriage affairs, while criminal law dealt with offenses towards public as a whole, murder, assault, arson, etc. And also, punishments were specifically dealt based on your social class. So if you were a noble, somebody higher up in the social rank, your punishment would not be severe as, say, a slave who would get a much, much harsher punishment. Okay, so this is a major contribution of Hammurabi and his Babylonian Empire. Alright, so that's all we got for today. Make sure you finish up anything with your notes. You write down any questions you have for me, and I will see you guys in class.